Hi, second grade. So it is time to get back into Mr. Popper's Penguin. So last week we read chapter 1, 2, and 3. And in chapter 3, you found out what the surprise was from Admiral Drake. And that surprise was a real life penguin. Okay, and so Mr. Popper's getting used to having this penguin around. And I want us to think before we start to read chapter 4, Mr. Popper knows about the penguin. Bill and Janie know about the penguin. But someone doesn't know about the penguin, okay? Think about who is that someone who doesn't know about the penguin yet? And this chapter is called Captain Cook. And remember, we learned that he was named Captain Cook because he kept making that sound, gook, gook, and it sounded like he was saying cook, okay? So let's read chapter 4 and see what happens. Call who, Captain Cook? Asked Mrs. Popper, who had come in so quietly that none of them had heard her. Why, the penguin, said Mr. Popper. I was just saying, he went on as Mrs. Popper sat down suddenly on the floor to recover from her surprise. I was just saying that we'd name him after Captain Cook. He was a famous English explorer who lived about the time of the American Revolution. He sailed all over where no one had ever been before. He didn't actually get to the South Pole, of course, but he made a lot of important scientific discoveries about the Antarctic region. He was a brave man and a kind leader, so I think Captain Cook would be a very suitable name for the penguin here. What? Said Mrs. Popper. Gork, said Captain Cook, suddenly getting lively again. With a flap of his flippers, he jumped from the tub to the washstand and stood there for a minute, surveying the floor. Then he jumped down, he walked around Mrs. Popper, and then he began to peck at her ankles. Stop him, Papa, screamed Mrs. Popper, retreating into the hallway with Captain Cook after her, and Mr. Popper and the children followed. In the living room, Mrs. Popper paused, and so did Captain Cook, for he was delighted to see this new room. Now, a penguin may look very strange in a living room, but a living room looks very strange to a penguin. I'm going to read that again. Now, a penguin may look very strange in a living room. Picture your living room where your TV is at, and then picture a penguin there. That's kind of a strange thought, right? Okay, but now it's saying, but a living room looks very strange to a penguin. Do you think a penguin's ever seen a living room before, especially Captain Cook? Even Mrs. Popper had to smile as they watched Captain Cook with the light of curiosity in his excited circular eyes and his black tailcoat dragging behind his little pink feet. Strut from one chair to another, he was pecking at each to see what it was made of, and then he turned suddenly and marched into the kitchen. Maybe he's hungry, said Janie. Here's a picture of Captain Cook. Captain Cook immediately marched up to the refrigerator. Gork? He inquired, turning to slant his head wisely at Mrs. Popper and looking at her pleadingly with his eyes, like, please. He certainly is cute, she said. I guess I'll have to forgive him for biting my ankle. He probably only did it out of curiosity. Anyways, he's a nice clean-looking bird. Ork, repeated the penguin, nibbling at the metal handle of the refrigerator door. Mr. Popper opened the door for him, and Captain Cook stood very high, and he leaned his sleek black head back so that he could see what was inside. Now that Mr. Popper's work was over for the winter, the refrigerator was not quite as full as usual, but the penguin did not know that. What do you suppose he wants to eat? Asked Mrs. Popper. Well, let's see, said Mr. Popper, and he removed all of the food and left it on the kitchen table. Now then, Captain Cook, take a look. The penguin jumped up onto a chair and from there onto the edge of the table, flapping his flippers again to recover his balance. Then he walked around the table and between the dishes of food and inspecting everything with the greatest interest, though he touched nothing. Finally, he stood still, very tall. He raised his beak to point at the ceiling and made a very loud, almost purring sound. Or! Or! He called. That's a penguin's way of saying how pleased it is, said Mr. Popper, who had read about this in his Antarctica books. Apparently, however, what Captain Cook wanted to show was that he was very pleased with their kindness, not so pleased with the food. For now, To their surprise, he jumped down and walked into the dining room. I know, said Mr. Popper. We ought to have some seafood for him. Some canned shrimp or something. Or maybe he isn't hungry yet. I've read that penguins can go a whole month without food. So here's Captain Cook with all the food in front of him. Do you think it'd be a good idea for him to eat this or for him to eat some canned shrimp? Why might canned shrimp be a good idea? Mama, Papa, called Bill. Come see what Captain Cook has done. Captain Cook had done it all right. He had discovered the bowl of goldfish on the dining room windowsill. Okay, so we just said that Captain Cook needed some fresh seafood or shrimp or fish. What do you think may have happened to the goldfish, the family pet goldfish? Captain Cook had done it all right. He had discovered the bowl of goldfish on the dining room windowsill. By the time Mrs. Popper reached over to lift him away, he had already swallowed the last of the goldfish. Bad penguin, said Mrs. Popper, glaring down at Captain Cook. Captain Cook squatted guiltily on the carpet and tried to make himself look really small. He knows he's done wrong, said Mr. Popper. Isn't he smart? Maybe we can train him, said Mrs. Popper. Bad, naughty Captain, she said to the penguin in a loud voice. Bad to eat goldfish, and she said, spanking him on the back of his head. Before she could do that again, Captain Cook waddled back into the kitchen. There the Poppers found him trying to hide in the open refrigerator. He was squatting under the ice cube coils, under which he could barely squeeze. Sitting down, his round white circle eyes looked out at them mysteriously from the dimness from inside the box. I think that's about the right temperature for him, said Mr. Popper. We should let him sleep in there tonight. But where am I going to put the food? Asked Mrs. Popper. Oh, I guess we can get another refrigerator for the food, said Mr. Popper. Look, said Janie, he's gone to sleep. Mr. Popper turned the cold control switch to its coldest setting so that Captain Cook could sleep more comfortably. Then he left the door open just a little bit so that the penguin would be able to get plenty of fresh air to breathe. Tomorrow I will have the icebox service department send a man out to put some holes in the door for air, he said, and then he can put a handle on the inside of the door so that Captain Cook can go in and out of the refrigerator as he pleases. Well, my dear, I never thought we would have a penguin for a pet, said Mrs. Popper. Still, he behaves pretty well, and he is nice and clean, that perhaps he'll be a good example for you and the children. And now I declare we must get busy. We haven't done anything but watch that bird. Papa, will you help me set the beans on the table, please? Just a minute, answered Mr. Popper. I just happened to think that Captain Cook will not feel right on the floor of the icebox. Penguins make their nests out of pebbles and stones. So I will take some ice cubes out of the tray and put them under him. That way he'll be more comfortable. Okay, so chapter 4, Mrs. Popper comes home and she meets Captain Cook. I want you to think about the questions that you're going to be asked for chapter 4. The first one is, what is Mrs. Popper's reaction to the penguin? When she first walks in, how does she feel about Captain Cook? You can think, maybe that opinion changes a little bit, okay? Tell me about how Mrs. Popper reacts to meeting Captain Cook. The second question for chapter 4 is, do they let Captain Cook stay? Are they going to keep him there with them in Stillwater in their home? Or are they going to send him back to Antarctica? Okay, go ahead and answer those questions and we will read chapter 5 next.